BTS news today. What was supposed to be a simple notification on a quiet day turned into one of the most emotionally overwhelming moments ARMY had experienced in a long time. When the familiar alert appeared on phones across the world announcing a BTS OT7 Weverse live, time seemed to pause. No teasers, no countdown, no official statement beforehand. Just 7 names, together again, in a space that had always felt intimate and honest. Within seconds, millions poured in, hearts already racing before a single word was spoken. The screen flickered to life, and there they were. Jin's warm smile, slightly softer than fans remembered. Suga sitting back, eyes thoughtful, as if carrying stories he hadn't yet decided to share. RM adjusting his posture, composed but visibly emotional. J-Hope waving brightly, trying to lift the mood even before it dipped. Jimin sitting close to Jungkook, shoulders almost touching, while Taehyung leaned in from the side, his expression unreadable. Jungkook, quieter than usual, offered a small wave that somehow said more than words ever could. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. They simply looked at the screen, reading comments that flew by too fast to comprehend. That silence, heavy and tender, was the first crack in ARMY's composure. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't accidental. It felt deliberate, as if BTS wanted everyone to breathe together, to exist in the same emotional space before moving forward. RM was the first to speak, his voice calm, but edged with something deeper. He greeted ARMY gently, thanking everyone for coming so suddenly. He said they didn't want to make a big announcement, didn't want to create unnecessary expectations. They just wanted to talk. That word alone, talk, was enough to make fans uneasy and hopeful at the same time. BTS talking freely had always meant honesty, and honesty had a way of hurting before it healed. Jin laughed lightly, trying to soften the moment, joking that it felt strange to be together like this again on Live. His laugh lingered a second too long, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as the viewers. J-Hope followed with his signature energy, saying he missed seeing ARMY in real time, missed this kind of connection. Yet even his smile wavered, and the chat noticed immediately as the minutes passed. The atmosphere shifted. It wasn't dramatic in a loud way. There were no sudden tears, no shocking confessions. Instead, it was the quiet honesty that began to settle in, the kind that sneaks up on you and tightens your chest before you realize you're crying. Suga spoke next, his tone low and careful. He talked about time, about how strange it feels when life moves faster than the heart can process. He said there were moments when even they didn't know how to explain what they were feeling, moments when silence felt safer than words. He apologized, not for disappearing, but for worrying ARMY. That apology broke something open. Fans had never blamed them. Yet hearing Suga acknowledge the concern validated emotions many had tried to suppress. Jimin listened intently, nodding, his eyes glossy. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled just enough to be noticeable. He said there were nights when he scrolled through messages from fans, reading worries, hopes, jokes, and love, and felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of being someone's comfort. He admitted that sometimes he didn't feel strong enough, that sometimes he felt guilty for not smiling when ARMY expected him to. Jungkook glanced at him then, his expression soft, protective. Taehyung leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, and spoke about identity. He talked about how people see BTS as a symbol, an unbreakable unit, a source of strength, but forget that behind that symbol are 7 individuals still learning who they are. He said he was grateful, endlessly grateful, but also afraid of disappointing the people who love them the most. His honesty felt raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. Then came the moment that truly shattered ARMY. Jungkook, who had been quiet for most of the live, finally spoke. His voice was steady at first, but his eyes told a different story. He said he didn't know how to say what he wanted to say without sounding dramatic, so he asked ARMY to listen carefully. It began with he talked about growing up in front of the world, about how BTS and ARMY grew together, shaping each other in ways that couldn't be separated around the world. He admitted that there were days when he felt lost, days when the pressure to be Jungkook of BTS made him forget how to just be Jungkook. He paused, swallowing hard, and then said something that echoed across the fandom instantly. He said that BTS had never taken ARMY's patience for granted, that every moment of silence, every gap between appearances, every unanswered question weighed heavily on them. He said they weren't stepping away from ARMY, and they weren't leaving BTS behind. They were simply trying to survive in a world that kept demanding more without allowing space to breathe. As he spoke, Jimin reached out, placing a hand on Jungkook's arm. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, but it carried years of shared struggle and unspoken understanding. RM nodded slowly, eyes shining. Jin looked down, blinking rapidly. J-Hope pressed his lips together, forcing a smile that didn't quite hide his emotion. Suga closed his eyes for a moment, as if grounding himself. Taehyung exhaled deeply, shoulders dropping. ARMY watched, helpless and grateful all at once. The live chat was no longer moving at lightning speed. Instead, messages slowed, filled with hearts, promises, and reassurance. Take your time. We're here. You don't owe us anything. Just be happy. Across languages and countries, the sentiment was the same. For once, ARMY wasn't asking for content, updates, or answers. They were offering comfort back. RM returned to speak, thanking ARMY for that understanding. He said this live wasn't about announcements or plans. It was about trust. He said BTS trusted ARMY enough to show up without scripts, without filters, and speak honestly, even if it made them vulnerable. He admitted that vulnerability was scary, especially when millions were watching, but he believed it was necessary to J-Hope, then added that happiness wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like rest. Sometimes it looked like silence. He asked ARMY to see those moments not as absence, but as preparation. His words were gentle, hopeful, yet heavy with meaning. Jin closed his eyes briefly and said he wanted ARMY to remember one thing above all else. That BTS had always come back to this place, to this connection, no matter how far life pulled them in different directions. He said this live was proof of that. Proof that even when things felt uncertain, their bond remained intact. As the live neared its end, the members leaned closer together, fitting themselves into the frame as they had done so many times before. They laughed softly about who was blocking the camera, about how cramped it felt, about how they should do this more often. But beneath the laughter was a shared understanding that this moment mattered. Jimin smiled through tears and said he hoped ARMY wouldn't cry after the live ended. Jungkook laughed quietly and said it was probably too late for that. Taehyung teased that ARMY always cried too easily, earning a chorus of playful protests from the others. Suga shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. RM thanked everyone once more, his voice firm but warm. J-Hope waved enthusiastically, promising to meet again soon. Jin blew a kiss toward the camera, telling ARMY to take care of themselves. And then, just like that, the screen went dark to end. Dramatic music. No final announcement. Just silence. ARMY stared at their screens long after the live ended, tears streaming freely. Not because BTS had said goodbye, but because they had said hello in the most honest way possible. Because they had trusted ARMY with their fears, their fatigue, and their truth. Because for the first time in a long while, it felt like the distance between idol and fan had dissolved into something simpler, something pure. The Weverse live didn't leave ARMY in tears because of sadness alone. It left them in tears because of love, because of relief, because of the quiet realization that BTS were still here, still together, still choosing honesty over perfection. It was a reminder that behind the global phenomenon, behind the records and the stages, were 7 people holding onto each other and to ARMY, doing their best to move forward. And perhaps that was the real reason the world cried that day. Because in a time filled with noise and uncertainty, BTS chose to sit down, look into the camera, and say, without grand gestures or promises, we're still here, and we trust you to stay with us. For ARMY, that was more than enough. The hours after the BTS OT7 Weverse live passed in a strange blur for ARMY around the world. Some fans sat quietly in their rooms, phones still warm in their hands, replaying certain moments again and again as if afraid the memory would slip away too quickly. Others rushed to social media, trying to put into words what their hearts were struggling to process. Timelines filled not with screaming headlines or exaggerated theories, but with simple sentences typed through tears. I feel seen. They're human. I'll wait. Thank you for trusting us. Clips from the live spread rapidly, but unlike previous viral moments, these clips weren't about jokes, chaos, or unexpected spoilers. They focused on pauses, on Jungkook's eyes lowering before he spoke, on Jimin's trembling voice, on RM's steady leadership cracking just enough to reveal how heavy the responsibility truly was, on Jin's forced laughter turning soft and sincere, on Suga's quiet honesty, on J-Hope's brightness holding back something fragile, on Taehyung's thoughtful gaze that seemed to look far beyond the camera. Media outlets tried to summarize what had happened, but many struggled. How do you condense something built on silence, emotion, and trust into a few paragraphs? Some headlines called it a heartfelt reunion. Others described it as a deeply emotional confession. But ARMY knew better. It wasn't a reunion. They had never truly left. And it wasn't a confession in the scandalous sense. It was a conversation, one that had been waiting to happen. Fans began to notice details they had missed during the live itself. The way the members instinctively leaned toward each other whenever someone spoke honestly. The way they nodded, offering silent support instead of interrupting. The way Jungkook kept glancing at the others, as if seeking reassurance that it was okay to be this open. The way Jimin mirrored his movements unconsciously, their bond speaking louder than any explanation ever could. There was also a growing sense of relief. For months, uncertainty had hung heavy in the air. Gaps between updates had been filled with speculation, fear, and sometimes cruel rumors. Some fans had tried to stay strong, reminding others to trust BTS. Others had quietly worried, afraid to voice their concerns out of respect. The Weverse Live didn't erase those months, but it gave them context. It reminded ARMY that silence was not abandonment, and distance was not rejection. In fan communities, conversations shifted almost overnight. Instead of asking when the next appearance would be, many began asking how the members might be feeling right now. Instead of demanding clarity about the future, fans spoke about protecting the present. There was a noticeable change in tone. softer, and more understanding, as if the live had recalibrated the emotional relationship between BTS and ARMY. Older fans, who had been there through the early years, shared memories of similar moments from the past. They talked about times when BTS had stood at crossroads before, uncertain but honest. They reminded newer fans that BTS had always grown through communication, not perfection. That this vulnerability was not weakness, but tradition. What made the live especially powerful was what BTS did not say. They didn't announce a comeback. They didn't promise timelines. They didn't offer guarantees. In an industry built on constant output and reassurance, that absence was almost radical. It forced ARMY to confront something deeper than schedules and plans. It asked them to sit with uncertainty and choose trust anyway. For Jungkook, many fans felt a particular ache. His words about identity and pressure resonated deeply, especially with those who had grown up alongside him. They saw not the golden magne on stage, but a young man who had carried expectations since childhood. His honesty didn't diminish his strength, it redefined it. In admitting confusion, he became more real than ever. Jimin's vulnerability sparked a wave of empathy. Fans spoke about the weight of being someone's comfort while needing comfort yourself. His admission touched people far beyond the fandom, resonating with anyone who had ever felt responsible for others' happiness. Taehyung's reflections on identity echoed similarly, reminding fans that even global icons struggle with self-definition. That RM's leadership, steady yet exposed, reaffirmed why he was trusted to guide the group. He didn't hide behind polished speeches. He spoke like someone who had spent long nights thinking about responsibility and trust. Suga's measured words carried the wisdom of someone who understood pain deeply and refused to romanticize it. J-Hope's effort to stay bright, even while acknowledging rest and silence, felt like a quiet lesson in balance. Jin's warmth grounded the entire live, reminding everyone that humor and sincerity could coexist, even in heavy moments. As night fell in some parts of the world, and morning rose in others. ARMY continued to process. Some cried again, this time more gently. Others smiled, feeling oddly calm. There was sadness, yes, but also reassurance. The live had not solved everything, but it had shifted the emotional landscape. Fear gave way to patience. Anxiety softened into understanding. Perhaps the most powerful outcome was the renewed sense of mutual respect. BTS had trusted ARMY with their truth, and ARMY responded not with demands, but with support. It felt like a reset, a reminder of why this relationship had lasted so long despite pressure, fame, and changed in the days that followed. Fans continued to quote lines from the live, not as dramatic soundbites, but as quiet reminders. Happiness can look like rest. Silence doesn't mean absence. We're still here. These words became anchors, something to return to whenever doubts crept in. The BTS OT7 Weverse Live didn't leave ARMY in tears because it marked an ending. It left them in tears because it reaffirmed something enduring. That behind the lights and the legends, there were 7 people choosing honesty. That behind the fandom's devotion, there was space for patience and care. That even in uncertainty, connection could remain strong. And maybe, in the end, that was the most comforting truth of all. Not that everything was clear, but that no one was facing the unknown alone. In the quiet days that followed, the impact of the BTS OT7 Weverse Live continued to unfold in ways no one had anticipated. It was no longer just a memory of a broadcast. It had become a reference point, a shared emotional landmark that ARMY kept returning to whenever uncertainty surfaced. People spoke about it not as that live, but as that moment, as if it existed outside time, suspended between what had been and what was yet to come. Fan letters began appearing across platforms, written with a gentleness that felt different from before. Many addressed the members not as idols, but as people. They thanked them for surviving, for enduring, for choosing honesty over silence. Some fans admitted that they, too, had been struggling with expectations placed on them by family, work, or society, and that hearing BTS speak openly made them feel less alone. In this way, the Live quietly extended its reach beyond fandom boundaries, touching lives in ways metrics could never measure. There was also a subtle but noticeable shift in how people spoke about the future of BTS. Instead of loud predictions or anxious countdowns, there was a collective willingness to wait. Waiting no longer felt empty or frightening. It felt purposeful. Fans reminded each other that growth required time, and that rest was not the enemy of creativity, but often its foundation. Industry observers, long accustomed to viewing BTS through numbers and achievements, found themselves pausing. Some wrote that the Live represented a rare moment of vulnerability in an industry that often demanded emotional performance without emotional honesty. Others noted how unusual it was for a group of BTS's stature to appear without promotion, without agenda, simply to connect. Even those outside the fandom acknowledged that what had happened was not standard practice. It was personal, for BTS themselves, though they did not speak publicly about the aftermath. Fans sensed that something had shifted internally as well. Small signs began to appear. A brief message posted late at night. A photo shared without explanation. A song lyric quoted quietly. These gestures felt less like content and more like check-ins, subtle confirmations that the bridge between them and ARMY remained open. Jungkook, in particular, drew attention when he shared a short message thanking fans for understanding. It was simple, almost understated, but it carried weight. For someone who had spoken about pressure and identity, that gratitude felt like a step toward reclaiming space for himself. Fans responded not with overwhelming noise, but with reassurance, honoring the tone he had set that Jimin's name trended again, not because of speculation, but because fans shared messages wishing him warmth and peace. Many spoke about how his honesty had encouraged them to be kinder to themselves. Taeyong's words about identity inspired art, poetry, and quiet reflections shared online. RM's leadership quotes were saved and revisited, treated like guiding principles rather than slogans. Jin's gentle humor became a source of comfort, reminding fans that lightness could exist alongside heaviness. Suga's calm acceptance of uncertainty resonated deeply with those who had learned that not every question needed an immediate answer. J-Hope's message about happiness taking many forms became a mantra for rest. As weeks passed, the initial intensity softened into something steadier. The tears faded, but the understanding remained. ARMY began to notice that their own behavior had changed. They checked themselves before jumping to conclusions. They defended BTS not with anger, but with context. They reminded each other of the trust that had been reaffirmed on that live. What made this moment especially significant was that it did not demand to be remembered through spectacle. There were no viral dances or shocking revelations to anchor it in pop culture history. Its power lay in its simplicity. 7 people, sitting together, choosing honesty. Millions listening, choosing empathy. In hindsight, many fans would later say that this Weverse Live marked the beginning of a new chapter, not defined by timelines or projects, but by maturity. Both BTS and ARMY had grown. The relationship between them had evolved from one built solely on admiration to one grounded in mutual care. There was a quiet understanding that when BTS returned more visibly, whenever that might be, it would not be the same as before. And that was not something to fear. Change, as the live had shown, was not the opposite of love. It was often proof of it. Until that day came, ARMY held onto the memory of that screen lighting up unexpectedly, of 7 familiar faces appearing together, of voices shaking but steady, of truths spoken softly. They carried it with them, not as a source of sadness, but as reassurance. Because in a world that often demanded constant proof of presence, BTS had offered something far more meaningful. They had shown that even in silence, even in rest, even in uncertainty, connection could endure. And so ARMY waited. Not anxiously, not desperately, but with a quiet faith rooted in that night, when BTS chose to sit down, speak honestly, and remind everyone that some bonds do not fade with time. They deepen. As time continued to move forward, the BTS OT7 Weverse Live slowly transformed from an emotional event into a quiet compass for the fandom. It became something ARMY returned to mentally whenever doubts resurfaced, whenever rumors flared up, whenever silence stretched longer than expected. Instead of panic, many remembered the expressions on the members' faces that night. The honesty, the vulnerability, the unspoken promise that trust still existed on both sides. What stood out most, in retrospect, was how unguarded the members had been. BTS were known for their professionalism, for perfectly timed words and carefully structured messages. Yet during that live, there were moments when sentences trailed off, when eyes drifted away from the camera, when silence filled the space between them. Those pauses spoke volumes. They revealed exhaustion, yes, but also sincerity. It was as if the members had decided that if they were going to speak at all, they would do so without armored. ARMY began to realize that the tears they shed were not born from fear of loss, but from recognition. Recognition of themselves in the members' struggles. Recognition of the years they had walked together, growing older, more aware, more vulnerable. For many fans who had spent their own youth alongside BTS, the live felt like a mirror. Life had changed, dreams had shifted, responsibilities had grown heavier, and yet, the connection remained. There was also a growing understanding that BTS were standing at a delicate intersection between who they had been and who they were becoming. The live did not frame this as a crisis, but as a process. Growth rarely arrived with certainty. It arrived with questions, hesitation, and moments of stillness. BTS did not hide that truth. They invited ARMY to witness it. Behind the scenes, speculation inevitably continued, but it lacked the sharp edge it once had. Instead of fueling fear, many fans actively pushed back against harmful narratives. They reminded each other that the members had asked for trust, not theories. That night on Weverse became a reference point whenever lines were crossed. Remember what they said? Fans would write. They're human. Jungkook's words, in particular, continued to echo. His quiet confession about losing sight of himself resonated deeply in a generation raised under constant observation. Fans spoke about how rare it was for someone of his status to admit uncertainty so openly. It didn't weaken his image. It strengthened it. He became not just an idol admired from afar, but a person who had survived pressure and was still learning how to breathe within it. Jimin's vulnerability lingered just as strongly. His fear of not being strong enough for others struck a chord with countless people who had been cast as emotional pillars in their own lives. Fans began sharing stories inspired by his words, talking about burnout, empathy, and the invisible weight of being the comfort one. In that sense, the live quietly opened conversations that went far beyond music. Taehyung's reflections on identity inspired a different kind of response. Artists created pieces exploring duality, masks, and self-discovery. Writers penned letters about learning to exist beyond expectations. His calm honesty gave permission to question, to evolve, to exist without having all the answers. RM's role during the live continued to be praised, not for authority, but for balance. He did not speak over the others. He did not rush the conversation. He guided it gently, allowing space for each voice. Fans noted how leadership, in that moment, looked less like control and more like care. Suga's presence, steady and thoughtful, grounded the emotional weight of the live. His acceptance of uncertainty felt like wisdom earned through experience. He did not romanticize struggle. He acknowledged it and allowed it to exist without forcing resolution. For many fans, that honesty was comforting in its realism. J-Hope's message about happiness taking different forms quietly reshaped expectations. Fans began quoting it whenever someone felt guilty for resting or stepping back. His words reframed joy not as constant brightness, but as something that could exist even in quiet moments. Jin's warmth remained a steady thread throughout the memory of that night. His ability to lighten the atmosphere without dismissing the seriousness of the conversation reminded fans that sincerity did not have to be heavy all the time. Sometimes, laughter was not avoidance, but survival. As months passed, the Weverse Live became less about tears and more about grounding. It was no longer something that hurt to remember. It was something that steadied people. Whenever BTS appeared individually or together, fans interpreted their actions through the lens of that night, with patience rather than urgency. The silence that followed was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with meaning. ARMY understood now that not every chapter needed to be loud to be significant. Some chapters existed to create space, to allow healing, to redefine what connection looked like when both sides had grown. And so, the story of that BTS OT7 Weverse live continued to live on, not as a dramatic turning point marked by headlines, but as a quiet promise shared between 7 artists and millions who love them. A promise rooted not in certainty, but in trust, not in constant presence, but in enduring bond. In the end, what left ARMY in tears was not the fear of goodbye, but the realization that even in change, even in silence, even in moments of uncertainty, BTS and ARMY were still walking forward together.